Hello, I'm Chris Flisher, and welcome to Turning of the Wheel, an intelligent, lively discussion on astrology, art, and adventure. Timing is everything, and as the great wheel turns, we are best prepared when we are best informed. Join me as I explore the current planetary alignments and offer insights for coping with change. Educational, informative, enlightening, the Turning of the Wheel is a welcome pause in your daily swirl of constant change. Through intelligent discourse, inspired guests, and educational segments, I will help to enlighten your knowledge of astrology and guide you to accept change as the great wheel of life turns. Call in with your questions and speak with some of the greatest visionaries in the time-tested practice of astrology. Turning of the Wheel, Astrology, Art, and Adventure with Chris Flisher, live each Friday, 11 a.m. Eastern, 8 a.m. Pacific on Awakening Zone Radio. Hello, everyone, and welcome to Turning of the Wheel. My name is Chris Flisher. As you know, this is a show about astrology, art, and spiritual adventure. And it's my great pleasure today to have a wonderful guest on. We'll be getting to him in a few short minutes. As you know, I try to get the best people possible to discuss where we see the world going and how we see the planet evolving. The title of the show today is A Planet in Evolution, and my guest will be on shortly. I'm going to give you an introduction to him shortly as well. I want to remind you of a few quick announcements first. First of all, my newsletter, which comes out every Sunday evening at 5:30, provides the glimpse of the week ahead for your sign. It's most important that you read your sun sign as well as your rising sign. When you combine those two together, you get a very accurate indication of what's going to be happening in your week to come. Sort of the room in which the theme is going to be unfolding in your life as you come forward in the week ahead. It's very accurate. I get a lot of great response for it. And if you don't know your rising sign, you can go to my website. There's a rising sign calculator there. All you do is enter your birth date, place, and time. And if you don't know the time, ask your mother, and we're pretty sure that she was there. And actually, once we know that, we can get much more granular view of what your chart looks like and where the houses fall, and then we'll know the exact action. But when you read your rising sign and your sun sign, you should always memorize the two of them. Always read them together, and if your rising sign happens to be the same as your sun sign, then you should contact me at chris@chrisflisher.com, and I'll help you find your moon sign, which we can then use as an alternate in that fashion as well. So, newsletter comes out every Sunday evening. You can get to it from my website, and it's easy to sign up for, so that when you get to your workplace on Monday morning, it is there and will tell you exactly what's going on throughout the week. It's interesting for me to watch because sometimes people open it immediately to see what's going on. Other people wait until later in the week to see if what I said was true, and invariably it is. So that's we know that astrology works. So, as I mentioned earlier in the beginning there, my topic for today is a planet in evolution, and I have on today one of the greatest astrologers in the world, I think for sure. His name is Tad Mann, also known as A.T. Mann, M-A-N-N. His website is atmann.net, and he's an astrologer, an author, an artist, an architect, a writer, and a speaker, and he's been on the astrology field, I guess, for whatever you want to call it, for millennia now, it seems like, at least for decades. And he started out as an architect. And it's interesting how many astrologers I run across who have a strong architectural leaning in their background. I think it has to do with the geometry and the angles and the format that unfolds as we look at astrology, because astrology really is a geometric construct, and within that construct we see the relationships of planets. But interestingly enough, so his plan was to be an architect, and he went on forward and was born in New York City in 1943, received a degree from Cornell University as an architect. But it wasn't until he went took a journey to the Far East that he experienced a really profound sort of transformation and became an astrologer as a result. So after having this sort of very prominent position as an architect, he designed buildings and has won awards for his architecture. He went on to discover what I think is a real true purpose in his life, is to discover astrology. And he has written extensively about astrology. He's got numerous books on the topic and really is quite an authority and one of the foremost forward thinkers with regard to astrology and the divination tools that are all encompassed in that wonderful umbrella. So it's my great honor to welcome Tad Mann. He was my first guest on my show back in 2007, and here we are once again, catching up with each other, and I'm very happy to have you on. Welcome to the show, Tad.
Thank you, Chris. I appreciate it.
Yeah, it's great to have you back on again. I've always, you are probably more than anyone has always been a real inspiration to me because I stumbled upon your books years ago and was totally embraced by them and love the work that you've done because when we share so many things in common. We both study astrology, and I studied architecture for years, and we both have a similar interest in mandalas as well.
Yeah.
So it's great to have that connection. But I really think of you more than anything else. After all the sort of the hats that you wear, I do think of you primarily as an astrologer because I think you've just got a way and a knack of really, understanding that topic more than anything else. And as we look forward into the coming years, we see quite a bit of my audience. I've been speaking quite a bit about the cardinal planets and where we're seeing and where all the activity is, and we're really in fairly profound and earth-shattering times, as we've seen with recent events, at least meteorologically as well as politically. And I'm wondering, as you look into sort of looking at the charts and where we see things going, where is it do you think we'll be? What is it that you sort of see on the horizon as you look into this sort of malaise of complicated planets and alignments that we have coming forth?
I mean, I think, I do a newsletter also. It's very sporadic. It happens maybe once a month, maybe twice a month, maybe no times a month. But I've been covering the last couple of eclipses. As you know, there have been essentially 4 of them in the last month and a half or so.
Yeah.
And the thing you can't help noticing is that, all of these outer planets are in the first 8 or 9 degrees of the signs. And Neptune is in early Pisces, and Pluto's in early Capricorn, and Uranus is in early Aries. So the thing about it that's so unusual is that it obviously affects people born in the first 10 days of each sign. Meaning if your birthday is anywhere between the 20th and the 30th or 31st of any month, then you're likely to have been affected by these outer planet transits. And the thing about them is they all move very slowly, so they're actually dancing in concert with each other. And I think the Uranus-Pluto, correct me if I'm wrong, Chris, but I think the Uranus-Pluto is going to be in operation for another 2 or 2.5 or 3 years.
Yeah.
So it's
through 2015 we have it.
Yeah, so these influences are very highly repetitive, and that's one thing that's happening is that the outer planets, to my mind, are generational. And what I mean by that is that, Uranus is in each sign for 7 years, and Neptune for 15, and Pluto for almost 20. And so the point of it is that these particular planets don't really show personal characteristics in us, but rather they show our relationship to the collective, meaning to our own generation and to the public around us, and especially Pluto and Uranus that are in square now. Pluto is the public and Uranus is your individuality. So with Pluto and Uranus in square, it means everyone is being challenged to either accept the public view of things or to find their own particular individual path. And I think that's true of governments as well, in a way. And it's a very, very interesting situation to watch play out, because it hasn't happened in our lifetime so far, and it's a very rare occurrence, basically. So I think a lot of people are being challenged right now. And of course, the more planets in your birth chart that those outer planets aspect, the greater the likelihood that you're going through personal turmoil as well.
It's almost tangible. I mean, you can physically feel it. If you're a person with a strong cardinal play out of planets in your chart, it's very tangible. I mean, it's almost like, caffeine, so to speak. It's sort of coursing through your veins almost. You can feel it.
Well, it is. And the point is that, I have Ascendant at 6 Sag and Moon at 6 Aries and Uranus at 8 Gemini and Pluto at 7 Leo and Jupiter at 10 Leo. Mm-hmm. So I've really gotten whacked, and again, I think as astrologers, we really try to look deeper when, of course, those influences are happening to us.
Now, when you say that you really gotten whacked, is it more on a personal level, or is it more about direction? Because you'd mentioned that Pluto really is sort of a foundational, binding force that holds our foundation together, whereas Uranus becomes more the rebel in us. How have you seen it manifested in your own life? I mean, without getting too into specifics.
Well, for one thing, I've written a lot of books. I just had my 17th book published last October, The Sacred Language of Trees, and essentially the publishing business is collapsing.
Right.
Even when I get books published by New York publishers, they don't have the money to promote them at all, and so you do a book, you spend an awful lot of time and energy, and they spend actually quite a lot of money doing it, paying advances and paying to have it printed and so on, and then the book doesn't go anywhere.
Right.
So the whole business, that's very Plutonic, meaning publishing is migrating away from actual books to e-books or to Kindle or to other things like that, and I'm actually trying to follow that migration. So I'm learning how to convert a lot of my earlier books. Two of them have been published as e-books already, and they're available on Kindle. But, there are a lot of other books that I've done that are not in print. I'm never going to find a publisher for them. So it means that that transformative quality of Pluto, I've got to use by upgrading my skills and learning how to make electronic books.
Well, I think that the books that you've written that have been mostly textual and have been information-based, I think will transform fairly easy, and I think that's a fairly doable process. One of the problems I think you're going to run into is when it comes to your graphic work, which is very remarkable and equally as important and just as visually compelling. That's where the crux comes, because that doesn't translate as well to that sort of thing. Those books really are designed for coffee table books, and they require a book to sit in your lap and to look through and really enjoy.
No, I agree. I agree completely. I did a book years ago called The Round Art, which
right.
quite well.
Yeah.
And the book itself, it was as the visual part of it. I think I did 200 illustrations for it, and the visual element of the book was just as important as the words. And it kind of loses something because I'm at the moment trying to convert that book to a book on the Apple iPad format, which would allow the images to actually be there and be of a high quality. But of course, not everyone has an iPad. And
no, but I could see it actually working quite well there. As you could fan the pages across, and you could expand the illustrations to get more granularity and get in there, because the illustrations in that book are phenomenal. I think people should order it while they still can. It's called The Round Art, if you can find it. If one of the most impressive books that I own in my collection. I probably own 300 astrology books. It's just beautiful beyond compare. So the point being that, and the issue for people out there listening is that, when you have these collective influences acting on you, you don't need to be just a passive victim to it, but rather to find other media to really bring your message across. And I've been also spending a lot of time recently. I'm not ashamed to admit, going down to New York City and hanging out in Brooklyn with these friends of mine who are young guys in their 20s and 30s who are very hip to media, to the way social media work these days. Amazing designers. Most of them are clients of mine also, but I'm learning a lot from them. It's like that whole Pluto-Uranus influence, which is very transformative. I'm trying to work through it by really trying to upgrade my skills for another generation. I want to you're guys in their 20s and 30s. Yeah, you're really sort of redefining your foundation, and you have to change the foundation, and this is part of the process. And so I think you're actively engaged in that process in the right way, and it sort of is a rebellious kind of quality of sorts, because you've got to really shift your whole way of thinking. You're going from a time where cutting and pasting literally meant cutting and pasting with tape, and into an era where you have to deal with iPads and iPhones. So this is a sort of a foundational Plutonic kind of trend that we're all going through. I mean, graphic designers, musicians are all feeling this effects. This is no longer an analog world we live in.
Yeah, it's also interesting, in talking to one of my new friends recently, actually a couple of months ago, a very, very interesting thing came up, which I hadn't really thought about in the same way, but I think a lot of people out there in the audience will, which is he looked at a book of mine I wrote. It was published in 1986, and it's about reincarnation and astrology, and it's called The Divine Plot. And I've done a kind of digital version of it, and he was looking at it, and he said, "Oh my God, look at your bibliography. You had, something in the region of 110 books in the bibliography." Mm-hmm. And the point is, back in the 70s and 80s when I was beginning to do astrology, I read tons and tons of books. And I was explaining to him, he said, "Do you really read all these books?" And I said, "Yeah, I had to." Nowadays you can read a précis of a book by looking it up on Google or Amazon.com. But back in those days, I was explaining to him, and it became an amazing conversation. I said, I was living in London. I didn't have a car. I was raising my daughter, who was an infant at the time, and I would go look at these used bookstores. And bookstores back in those days, unlike Barnes & Noble, there was no computer. So no one knew exactly which books they had. So you had to kind of scrounge around the bookstore, and if I came across a book by someone who interested me, I'd buy it and read it. It might be Joseph Campbell, it might be an astrologer, it might be, a 10-year-old book, or it may be a 100-year-old book. And so I said to him, I read all these books because there was no other way to find the information. So not only learning, not only understanding what you're looking for in the book, but I never knew really what I was looking for. And so I learned a lot of ancillary things that became very interesting and valuable in retrospect. He was shocked because nowadays you can find a book in 2 minutes and have it sent to your Kindle.
Right, and then you also approaching it from the standpoint of having to actually physically read the pages and turn the pages. There's a very organic process that goes with that, all of which has become truncated now to the point where information has been compressed to the point where you're just getting salient points out. But you know what I would compare it to, and you would appreciate this. It's the difference between taking pen to paper and drawing a architectural drawing versus rendering it on a computer. Something has to happen organically with the pen to paper. Don't you agree?
Absolutely. Yeah. I was also explaining to someone recently that when I first went to Cornell architecture school in 1961, I was a naive guy, from upstate New York, and it was interesting because on the walls in the 50s at Cornell, they had gone through a stage of probably 30 or 40 years of what they call the Beaux-Arts, which is the French...
Right, Beaux-Arts, right, yep.
EAUX,
right.
ATS. And the Beaux-Arts encouraged people to make watercolor renderings of buildings. Mm-hmm. So on the walls at Cornell back in those days, there were these, very beautiful but quite antique already watercolor renderings of gas stations and hotels and architecture school building. And of course, the year we started, this group of guys from Texas called the Texas Rangers were worshipers of Le Corbusier,
right.
So European minimalist, architect. And so we then learned to start making drawings that had no watercolor, no color. It was all black and white, fine lines, very precise, very sparse, called international style architecture. And so it was the exact opposite of what had occurred before. And it was interesting because we did learn to write and to draw. In fact, I took drawing every one of the 5 years at Cornell. We were required to.
But something about that process was very organic and was very, it's almost like straight out of your amygdala, down your hand into your pen and onto the paper. It's, sort of very organic, very real, very tangible. That is being supplanted today all through the digital world with regard to graphic design, with regard to music, with regard to photography, to the point where it's all now very transportable, which is great. We can see it everywhere. But there's something very elemental that is missing in that process. And I'm wondering if that speed is a byproduct of this Uranus-Pluto shift. Is it? And if so, where does it go?
Well, I think it is. I think it is part of that shift. And I think, it's not only changing our individual lives, but it is actually changing the society as a whole. Because, in a way, I have friends, I'm 70 years old, and I have friends who can't keep up. They never really learned to use computers, and nowadays they're completely in the dark. And in a way, it's like you're cut out of the loop if that's the case. But I think all of those things are very Pluto-Uranus. But also it's very interesting. I've been thinking about this a lot recently. Is Neptune having entered Pisces, which is its own sign, and Neptune in Pisces really means that nowadays one does not know, first of all, where your boundaries lie. Think of the NSA thing.
Right. Of course. Yeah.
That there's no safety in writing emails or talking on your phone because someone probably is listening. And second of all, it represents the idea of illusion, meaning the internet is a very Piscean and Neptunian medium. So you read things on the internet and you never know whether they're true or not.
It's a very intangible world we have entered in, one that's really built on smoke and mirrors, literally. It's kind of like don't trust the man behind the curtain or watch out for the man behind the curtain, because it's like very Oz-like in that regard, because we really can't see what's beyond that veil. We feel as if we're safe. We feel as if we'd enter into an area where we have comfort, but little do we know that someone's watching us all this time.
Yeah, also, and the point of it is that, I don't know about you, but I mean, I look at movies, at movie theaters these days, and I don't really have any desire to see any of them because
very few,
they don't really have much content. They don't really have a kind of depth that movies in the 50s and 60s had. There were a lot of extraordinary films made back in those days, and it's kind of interesting, and I don't want to sound like an old fart, but the point being that I think that the entire kind of value system that we base our activities on is something that's really kind of dissolving before our eyes, and it is
yes,
kind of shocking in a way.
And yet, in order to be contemporary people living in a contemporary world, we have to use contemporary tools and be part of that contemporary world. So we have to either adapt or fall off the cliff, like you mentioned your older friends there. And so as a result, we learn to adapt. We find new methodologies for, getting our information out there. And it may not have the value that was once there. I certainly will grant you that. But I'm wondering if this is obviously it's a paradigm shift, and it's going to continue. And I wonder how it will impact us going forward, especially with regard to financial markets, for example. I mean, as money becomes less and less of a tangible thing, where does that leave us? And sort of how do you see the crux of these two? And we have the next three alignments will be on April 21st, will be a direct square of Pluto to Uranus, and then we have one in December 15th of 2014, and then the last is March 17th of 2015. Those will be the next three. So we've got three more to go through. We've been through four, three more to go through. What do you think will sort of crunch out as a result of that? How will it impact these people? Will it force it?
I think in terms of financial markets, I mean, the same idea that I was just talking about, which is that markets move up and down not based on what a company is worth. That's what used to determine companies going up and down on the stock market. Rather, it's about innuendo, and it's about all kinds of strange factors that are really not very logical.
Well, they're intangible. They're perceptions. We have these perceptions. It's perceived value that doesn't really. You can't put your fingers on a piece of software that's just this amorphous piece of something and living in the air. It's just very Neptunian, as you said.
That's right, and it's also like, for example, it's like when you buy software. I mean, some people know this, but not a lot probably. But when you buy software, if you read the fine print, you don't really own it. It's like, Microsoft
is sort of borrowing it, yeah,
and we're renting it at a very high price for a period of time.
Right.
And so as a result, we don't really have that access to the government or to the world around us. And I think that also is very much about that whole outer planet stuff. And I think I'm not really sure what the solution to it is, but another curious thing that I noticed, and I'm sure you'll have some feedback on this, Chris, and I'm sure you've noticed it too, is that because the outer planets are in the same area of the zodiac, meaning Capricorn, Pisces, and Aries, are really only four signs. They spread. They're a little more than a square. It's close to a trine, which is a third of the zodiac. And what that means is that when these outer planets go retrograde, they all go retrograde within a period of 3 months. It's like, I think Neptune just went direct the other day.
Right.
Same day that Mercury went direct.
That's right. Yes. Yeah.
And also Uranus and Saturn, I think, went direct last month. So if you're working on projects, and the idea is that when outer planets are moving forward, that those ideas will develop and move forward. But also, of course, the idea is that once they go retrograde, and especially when all three of the outer planets go retrograde at once, which happens these days, then suddenly everything just stops moving forward.
Yeah, and then I think that almost gives us a chance to catch our breath,
Right.
And in some ways, when interestingly enough, I'm reading a book about 1927 written by Bill Bryson, and what's interesting about it is that's an 84-year cycle backwards, which would put Uranus in a similar position as where it is today. So we look back, and of course there's a cyclical nature then. The major difference back then, of course, was that Jupiter was conjunct Uranus at the same time, bringing a much different flavor to it than what we see with a square to Pluto. So having Jupiter on your side is a nice thing. Having Pluto in your basement, tearing down your walls and your structure, is another story altogether. And I'm wondering how. I mean, obviously the new generations coming up, they're sort of born with this as part of their DNA. They adapt. But I guess what I'm trying to find out, and what your views are, is where we see this going down the road. Where does this digital, media push us? Where does it get us to? How does it force us to live our lives differently? Because we are entering a completely radically different type of methodology with regard to communication. The English language may disappear if it comes down to a simple tweet. And where do you see these things unfolding? I mean, do they disappear?
Well, I mean, I don't know whether we've talked about this before, but I know that a lot of young kids grow up without knowing how to write or read script handwriting.
Yeah, exactly.
So it's kind of funny because, I mean, you and I were raised doing it, and, you learned how to write it and read it and whatever, but it's now becoming obsolete almost. And I have a feeling that, my particular sense, particularly about Uranus-Pluto, has to do with the fact that I was in my 20s in the 60s when Uranus and Pluto went conjunct.
Right. Around
64 to 66, and it was a revolutionary time. And of course, the conjunction between Uranus-Pluto is like a seeding of it. It seeded this kind of revolutionary energy, which manifested in the desegregation movement, with political radicals at colleges in the U.S., with all of these kind of feminism, rock and roll, all of these radical movements were seeded in those times. And so now all of us, instead of being 20, are in our 60s or 70s. And what's interesting with the Uranus-Pluto square is that it's somehow shaking down now. And I think it really is a very radical shift that's going on. And, I can't help feeling that something quite extreme is on the verge of coming about. And
that's what I'm wondering. And I think that some of the seeds that were planted back there that you alluded to, such as segregation and feminism, came to light in the elections of Barack Obama and Hillary Clinton when they were on the stage. They were elevated to the stage at that point, which is very appropriate to the timing of the squares, because they were sort of they came to fruition at a time when these planets became squared to each other. So they were the spawn of that time, literally.
That's right. And I do think, however, that, it's easier to rebel against something than it is to suggest a viable alternative.
Yeah, that's very true. So we could be entering into that time when we see that happen. Yeah.
I think we're entering a time where it's a time, instead of just saying, everything is wrong, to being put in a position where we have to start really looking at what are the viable alternatives and what direction could the world go in that could shift these problems. And I think part of it is ecological. I think part of it, you're interested in architecture as I am. I think part of it is that, ecological design has to become kind of default standard of things.
Right. And sustainability has to become a priority. Right.
Exactly. Meaning it's not just something that's for rich people or for certain buildings.
No, it can't be. It has to be. It almost has to be written into the code. LEED's buildings need to be the profile. We need to have. We have to default to solar power being part and parcel of a building when it's designed, not just as an afterthought.
Right. It's like the buildings that my generation, and I stopped doing architecture, 30 years ago or something, but the buildings that I worked on in those days, one of the reasons why I stopped doing architecture was that I really didn't think that the aesthetic and the ideas behind it were really valid, meaning they're not, energy intent, they're not energy clever. They're just abusing energy basically. And I think really that one has to speak out against these things somehow, and begin to bring this whole new way of looking at the world into being that includes diet and hygiene and the use of chemicals and all kinds of things. I think
this is a very interesting thread that we're on here. I do want to take a quick break here just to pause for a commercial. We'll be back in about 2.5 minutes, so just hang in there. I want to continue out this because I want to continue on to the idea of your thoughts about architecture and art going forward. So we'll be right back in about 2 minutes. Hang in there.
Yeah.
Hi, this is Jeffrey Hoppe for the Crimson Circle. Thanks for listening to today's program on The Awakening Zone, the international network for empowered human awakening. The Awakening Zone is produced and sponsored by the Crimson Circle on the web at www.crimsoncircle.com. The website is a safe space to experience your spiritual journey without membership or dues and no dogma or rules. It's a gathering place for anyone who is awakening, no matter what their background or beliefs. The Crimson Circle Library contains over 10 years of some of the most insightful and provocative spiritual information available today, with channeled messages from the popular Tobias, Kutumi Lal Singh, and Adama St. Germain. Everything in the library is free. Just log in and download it in text, audio, or video formats. On the website, you can also find out about upcoming workshops and events, including tours to sacred and powerful sites around the world. Also, check out the store for a wide selection of home study courses and special topic channels. And finally, see if there's a Crimson Circle certified teacher in your area. They offer classes on subjects ranging from death transitions, spiritual birthing, ascension, clearing energy imbalances, and creating your own reality. With over 500 certifications worldwide, there's likely to be a Crimson Circle teacher near you. When you go to the Crimson Circle website, you'll see right away that you are not alone. There are humans all over the planet who, like you, are discovering the God within. Crimson Circle at www.crimsoncircle.com. Proud sponsors of the Awakening Zone Radio Network. And now, back to today's program.
Okay, welcome back to Turning of the Wheel. We have a great guest today, Tad Mann, A.T. Mann. His website is atmann.net. Remarkable visionary, author, architect, artist, astrologer, a real, one of the most erudite people I know on the planet who's been fully engaged in this sort of shift. And we're talking about a planet in evolution is the topic of the day. And in this topic, we are addressing the concepts of what we are sort of seeing on our daily lives. The fact that we no longer, the fact that we sit in the same room and we text each other rather than having a conversation. The fact that we reduce our lives to a digital kind of format rather than the analog paper and mortar that we used to live. And then, of course, there's always this strive for finding something new and branching out into new areas. Now, one of my roles as an individual is I work in a contemporary art museum as a docent, meaning that I'm a tour guide. And I see all kinds of modern art coming through, and it's wildly abstract and wildly difficult for me to comprehend. And I'm wondering, in your views as an architect and as a person who's very involved in this sort of media, how you see people pushing envelopes in ways that seem almost absurd and, intangible with regard to value or profit or anything, and of course the talent piece, just because of the shock value or just because of the fact that it's never been done before. How does that sit with you? I mean, does it make sense to to put 3 cups on a table and say that's a piece of art versus a sculpture that Henry Moore or Rodin did? I mean, how does that all sit with you?
It doesn't sit very well. I find it incredibly irritating, basically. And it's funny because the town I live in, Hudson, New York, that a performance artist from New York called Marina Abramovitz is making a huge center here shortly. And it basically, she does exactly those kind of performance pieces where, she'll sit in an empty room in the Metropolitan Museum for 24 hours or whatever it happens to be. The point being that I think I began moving a couple of years ago. I still make my living by doing astrology, but I began a couple of years ago writing books about the sacred. And to me, that was really a kind of valuable perspective on what a new direction could look like. One of the first books was Sacred Architecture that I did back in the 90s, but also more recently Sacred Landscapes and the Sacred Tree book. But the whole point is that we need to really start expressing our reverence for the natural world. And I don't mean we should become pagans necessarily, but I do think becoming active in bringing values that are ecological, that are sensible, back into being is something that really is a primary directive that we should all follow.
But is that not seen as being regressive because we would be going back to something we once knew? I mean,
the problem, I don't see it as being regressive because I think that it actually, there's a very new perspective on those things that I think is very, very valuable. I think, and interestingly enough, I think it was really initiated in the 60s.
So it's more of a redefinition of a time rather than a regressive. So what we're doing is rather than rather than saying, let's take a building as an example, rather than having a building just go up out of bricks and mortar, now we would embrace it with a much more of a green technology, making it more sustainable, making it more part of the landscape around it as opposed to just being an aesthetic, useful, entity, right?
Absolutely. I mean, that's the case, but I'm just saying that the values that lie behind things are really super important nowadays, and that it's not about, the way we sort the environmental issue out is not around recycling, although that's a part of it. What it's about is really rediscovering our reverence for nature and the natural world. It's like we breathe the air, and if we screw the air up, then none of us are going to have a very high survival rate. So part of it is really about rediscovering the fact that not that we need to revert to being primitives and living in that natural world, but we do need to learn a reverence for the planet, a reverence for the material world in that way that can guide our actions in a much more sensible way.
So we sort of take these primitive, and I'm using primitive on purpose, primitive elemental concepts of what it means to be in touch with the planet and bring it into a new context using contemporary tools perhaps, in a way that allows them to evolve differently. I think that's probably the best, homologation of those concepts, where we would be able to take the best of both and come up with something new that was useful and tangible and perhaps more, more portable. I mean, Steve Jobs seems to make everything more portable with regard to digital technology. Can you imagine what happens when they have digital smell and digital touch? I mean,
the Steve Jobs things. I mean, I have an iPhone and so on, but there is the danger to that is that a new phone comes out every 6 months, and of course they want you to jettison the old one and buy a new one. And so I just think this idea of kind of temporary value in society is once again something that really does need to be looked at.
Well, that's not an unusual topic. I mean, just ever since mass production became, Henry Ford's idea was to build planned obsolescence. So planned obsolescence as a concept was one of the major reasons that the First Depression actually happened. There was too much, supply and not enough demand because they shrank the middle class much the same way they have today. I went and saw Robert Reich's movie the other day, Inequality for All, and and talks totally about the evaporation of the middle class. If the middle class doesn't have money, then you can't sustain this. But in regard to all that, planned obsolescence is a part of it that does keep capitalism alive and going, because you have new products that need to be done. I understand the logic behind that, but you still have to have the financial muscle beneath that. And I'm wondering, looking forward along the same lines of this Pluto-Uranus kind of construct that we're in, if you see some sort of financial collapse that could be radical enough to shift all that.
Well, I do see financial collapse, but whether it's strong enough to shift all that in a good direction, I don't really know. I mean, I think again, the idea of, the modern day currency system is like disconnected from, it used to be gold standard, which is it actually, the money had value, but now the dollar's in a kind of free fall, and the implication really is that the root of it, a lot of my friends realize, is that it isn't really based on anything tangible. It's based on how people perceive it having value. So
yeah, that's that whole Neptunian thing, which is really, very accurate, because Neptune really is that foggy world where nothing makes sense, and money certainly enters into that world right now and is living there. I mean, we don't really know. If there were some sort of a solar flare that eliminated magnetism and all of this stuff disappeared on all these hard drives, we wouldn't have anything to show for other than our house or our lawnmower or our television. We wouldn't have tangible things to show for, and it's just an interesting kind of event. Coming up, I've been talking to people about Mars entering into Libra in the at a very critical time. I mean, this New Year's Eve and this Christmas Eve are fairly toxic days with regard to Mars. I mean, Mars is going to be entering into the early degrees and then eventually the middle degrees of Libra, what's going to put it in a direct, opposition to Uranus. And, what sort of things do you think you see then? I mean, Mars is very fiery. It's really the timekeeper. It's the trigger. It lights the fuse. What would you see coming out of that? I mean, it's just...
Well, I mean, it's very inflammatory, obviously. And if you look at recent years, there have been catastrophes almost every winter the last 3 or 4 years. I mean, hurricanes in New York State. I mean, that's unheard of and outrageous. And these major storms creeping up the East Coast, and floods, and New York City flooding, and, next Boston will flood. But the point being that I really do think that there are major environmental changes. People said a couple of years ago, there's no real problem. The real Earth changes aren't going to happen for 20 or 30 years, but they're actually happening now.
Yeah.
And I believe that a lot of the Mars is just a trigger.
It is a trigger, and these types of events that we're seeing, even though they are spectacular and they seem very ominous to us now, when we look back historically, we do see times, like in the 1927, 1926, I mean, the whole Mississippi Valley was completely underwater, and thousands upon thousands upon thousands of people in the United States were completely abandoned. So these types of major ecological events have happened in the past, and they probably will continue. Sure. I think more from a societal standpoint, as a species, I'm wondering how we adapt and how we move forward in this realm, intellectually and artistically and ethically, all those areas. I think life will get prolonged. There'll be new medicines. There's already new medicines that are on the break out there, new technologies, and I'm just wondering, where do we come out of this, as what is the ultimate process, and where do we go? I mean, by the year 2015, when this is done, it doesn't just come to a shuddering end and we say, wow, that was quite a storm that blew through. We have to see some sort of, and we have some free will involved in this too, individually, especially those of us I've got 7 planets in cardinal signs, and I'm totally on fire in some ways, but also somewhat stymied by the same token.
No, I understand that, and I think it is an accumulative thing. I don't think catastrophes lead us to really mend our ways, but I do think that people are gradually getting, well, at least some people are gradually getting that these environmental issues are very fundamental, and they require a very different kind of approach. It's not something you can stick a Band-Aid on and solve, but rather it's about really the fundamental core of how our entire system works. I did some talks in the 80s and 90s in Europe, what they called info echo, which was architects and designers that were engaged in information technology, but also had a very highly ecological frame of reference. And there was a conference in Holland back in those days that I participated in the mid-90s called Designing Desires.
Oh, interesting, yeah.
And it was interesting because it was about how do you design things that don't actually just become a clog to the whole system, but rather, have enough meaning so that people want to keep them.
Well, they have what you want to strike is an emotional chord that people would be responsible, would enter into them in a much different way. They'd be more enveloping. And architecture would become, Corbusier is actually probably the archetype of the antithesis of that because of the coldness and the concrete. I think we're talking about a more organic kind of process where buildings become more places that we need to involve in. They become more more womb-like, more maternal in a way.
Yeah, in some ways, yes. I mean, it's kind of interesting. Architects like Corbusier never lived in a building that he designed.
I can see why. I mean, I like him and I respect him as a historical figure. I just think that the buildings themselves leave a certain chilliness to them when I enter other buildings that are more.
Absolutely. I wouldn't want to live in them, and that's that's a really powerful statement, and it really does say a lot. And I think we need to readjust our values on a collective level. And, as an astrologer, we talk to people, as you know, all the time about choices they're making. And I think it's actually a very unusual and unique platform because it gives us an opportunity to be formative in that way, to get people really thinking about the choices they make and about the implications of those choices.
Yeah, and it is kind of. I mean, I would like to sort of in my limited way try to at least get people to think about, what it means to have progress in their lives. What does progress look like? And it doesn't necessarily mean doing something that hasn't been done before. I think there's a misnomer there. People think that because it hasn't been, which is what is driving the art scene, because 3 cups have not been placed on a shelf and called an art piece before, people think that they've created art when actually they've created nothing. The amount of work that goes into a sculpture, like a Rodin or a Henry Moore, or anybody who's well known for sculpture, Michelangelo or anybody like that, that the work involved was a labor of intense craftsmanship as well as an artistic vision. That is sort of interesting. So when we talk about moving forward, it does not necessarily imply that it hasn't been done before. There can be a moving down the ladder, down the line with the new ideas incorporated into old ones at the same time, I think.
Right, I agree. I mean, I think that, just in writing my tree book, my sacred tree book in the last couple of years, it's interesting because when you do a book like that, you think, well, it's just about writing about things you know. But of course, when you do write a book like that, what you discover is what you don't know. You discover by having to explore areas that you're not that familiar with and really beginning to kind of understand it on a very different level. And I think that kind of deeper thought is something that's a bit missing these days, and that something that when you really take the effort to really look more deeply, you come to really a different kind of conclusion about what really is what the direction is moving towards, and what is the right direction to take. Well,
you're looking at it, like I mentioned earlier, you're looking at it with contemporary eyes, so you've got all the contemporary trappings of whatever it means to be a contemporary human being, and so that forces you to look at it through a new filter. Absolutely. So I can see that. Before we started, you had mentioned that you were working on a project having to do with Gaiam TV, and I'm really interested to hear about that because that's a fascinating outlet with regard to getting a very positive message out there with regard to the planet and where we're going forward. So I'm curious what your sort of association there is and what you've been working on there.
Well, I did an interview. I went out to Boulder about a month and a half ago, and I did an interview that was conducted by a woman called Regina Meredith, and she interviews people who they consider to be kind of influential in some way. And it was a fascinating interview because instead of talking just about astrology or just about, books I've written and so on, it was really an opportunity to really express my philosophy of life and all of that. And it was really an extraordinary opportunity to do this because it was very professionally done. You can look at GAIAM TV, GAIAM, and look for the interview. I think it was called The Architecture of the Solar System. And it was interesting because it was about...
Great topic, yeah.
A kind of background of all of the things that I do, and probably the commonality of them, which is that a lot of my ideas about astrology are very unusual because it's very dynamic. I think, a la from Tibetan Buddhism, that I really think of people as being impermanent. Like the Dalai Lama says, we don't really have a self. We don't really define ourselves in that way. Rather, the self is like a kind of construct, and that as a result, there is no you. There's no one Chris Flisher. There are a series of hundreds or myriad Chris Flishers that interact in the course of your lifetime, and that we really become free by being able to be whoever we need to be at any given moment. And
so it's a question of reinvention. It's a question of adaptation, I guess is a good word.
It's perpetual adaptation, reinvention, but also being free from the constraints of having to be a particular way. So the thing is that the kinds of changes that are necessary for us to make as individuals now and in the very near future is that we need to be able to really step away from those bad habits we've developed or ways of living that haven't really been very valid particularly, and begin to really find a new way of being that's consistent with this new age or the new idea that's coming into being.
And that's what the squares would force. The squares are really our forcing functions that allow us to provide us with challenges that we have to overcome in order to grow. That's how I see a square. A square is very much of a learning step.
That's right. And the point being that in a way we need to really reinvent ourselves continually, because astrology is not about being one thing, but rather it's about this continuous process of change. And I think when you stop changing is is when you die and start becoming rigid. And so the whole dynamic of the way my astrology evolved, I was able to go into in a way that I don't in readings because I just don't have the time. But it was kind of fascinating because the response has been phenomenal. I mean, I've gotten emails from all over the world, and clients in Switzerland and Africa and all over Europe, all over the west coast of the U.S., and it's just really been a phenomenal response. If anyone out there is interested, go look for my interview on GAIAM TV.
Yeah, that's very that must be gratifying. See, now that's the sort of thing that you could not have accomplished in 1960, for example. You wouldn't have had that reach, but because of the digital delivery mechanism that we have now and your ability to get in there and express that, now the pool becomes much larger and your audience becomes much more organic and earthly. So I'm curious when you look at, because astrology really is who I see you as. I know you're a multifaceted man, but astrology is one of your basic, pillars. I'm wondering where you see astrology as a study, as a tool, as a divination process. Where do you see it going? Do you think it has more value today? Do you think it's more relevant? Do you think it's because as time goes on, we've got more empirical data to draw upon? Do you think it has more value, or will it have more value going forward?
Well, I have actually very strong views about that, and part of it is that I developed particular ideas years ago, the main one being that the solar system doesn't just sit in space, but rather, it moves 1 million miles a day around the center of the galaxy, and that this in itself is a very dynamic model, that in a way the image itself, and you can look on my website and see it, but this image of the spiraling solar system, that the sun's axis creates this kind of huge spiral of planets that looks very much like the DNA molecule. And I wrote books about it, and I taught about it, and it became integral to my whole worldview. And in the last 4 or 5 years, it's been incredible to me to see that a number of cutting-edge physicists that are really radical people, like Nassim Haramein is one. Another one is an Australian physicist called Garrett Lisi. And these guys are taking ideas that you and I have in common, Chris, which is geometry, astrology, genetics, physics, things like this, and they're discovering that these dynamics change dramatically when you move everything. And so for me, it's been the most incredible validation. And what I feel is that I think that at least my way of doing astrology is gradually coalescing with the most contemporary views of physics, and that it's bringing up parallels that are visual parallels.
And the parallels are all, I think, the common glue that holds this all together is mathematics, ultimately, don't you think?
Well, mathematics and geometry. It's like, there's a whole concept about the shapes of the astrological aspects, that are
right.
They're basically thirds of the circle, or quarters of the circle, or sixths of the circle, or eighths of the circle, and so on. And it turns out a lot of these shapes are. I was just reading something the other day that was absolutely riveting about that these shapes, like a hexagon and a pentagon. A pentagon is a 5-sided regular solid. A hexagon is 6-sided, and there's also a 12-sided regular solid. But actually, the DNA molecule is made up of facets exactly like that.
Yeah, this is what I'm saying. Yeah, and then when we take these, when we take up and we look at astrology and we talk in terms of squares or trines or sextiles, it is the relationship of these planets to each other that creates the concept or the theme, rather than any sort of other outside force. It's really the relationship. Everything is based on a relationship to each other, whereby you A component and a B component, and therefore the joining of those two components creates a third complete element of some sort, an entity.
The gist of it is that, and this is pretty shocking, but the gist of it is that if you really undergo a kind of powerful realization that has a kind of, and astrology is just simply a language that expresses these things, but this particular kind of geometric dynamic is capable of literally changing your DNA. Mm-hmm. So it's like you're not only realizing something in an abstract sense, but rather that there's a very direct connection inherent in astrology and in its basic geometries and its basic language that actually resonates with and evokes genetic material.
And so then knowing those changes, this is where speaking with a true astrologer really helps. Knowing that you have the potential for those changes and you act accordingly, you are actually shifting your progress forward.
And that's exactly the point I'm making. And that's what my talk at Gaiam TV was about, which is that by entertaining these concepts of the fundamental way in which these forces manifest astrologically in your life, it actually puts you in a position where you can quite literally, change your genetic structure to correspond to the changes that are happening on a planetary level. And I think that implies something, and I'm not talking about space cadet language,
No, this is very simple. I totally get it. I mean, we're on the fringe of Star Trek, but I understand exactly, and I think this is very tangible and very real. And I think we will see this come into greater clarity as we age here. I think we're coming into a time when this is going to be one of the richest things we come away with.
Yeah, and I think, to me, it's amazing to see something that a lot of my peers responded to it and they respect me, but it hasn't really been completely embraced. But I'm beginning to see a time where such things are really going to be seen on a very different level. And it's funny because my astrology system is lifetime astrology, is extremely predictive. And when I first developed it, 30 years ago, 40 years ago now, I looked ahead into my own horoscope and I saw, this is a good news, bad news situation. It's great. I've made an amazing discovery. The bad news is that it's not really going to be acknowledged for 40 years, and it's coming true.
Yeah. So that is very frustrating, I can imagine. But, hopefully you'll be alive and well enough to see it come to fruition. I think we really are on the cusp of that.
It is already. I think it is.
Yeah, my guest today has been Tad Mann. I could talk for 3 or 4 more hours with you, no problem, but we are out of time. I encourage you to go to Tad Mann's website. It's atman, is double N at the end, .net, atman. net. Look up his interview on Gaiam TV. If you do a search on his name, either Tad Man, T-A-D Man, or A-T Man, you'll get lots of hits, and you'll be able to find him. I encourage you to look up his books and get them while they're still in print. This is a viable time. Not that the Kindle books won't work well and get you the information, but because they're so visually impactful, I encourage you to get them. And this is a person to watch and to follow, and definitely keep your eyes on him. And Tad, it's always been a great pleasure to have you on. I appreciate you very much coming on today and talking. I said we could talk for hours. So
thanks so much, Chris. I appreciate it, and we'll talk again soon.
Thank you so much for coming on. I appreciate it very much. Take care. Bye-bye.
You've been listening to the Awakening Zone Radio Network, offering insights and inspiration for our evolving consciousness.
Okay, folks, I'm still here. The number to call for a reading is 1-714-364-4353. I had a pre-recorded show today because sometimes it's the easiest way to connect with some of these people. These people that I try to get a hold of are they travel the world, they are on lectures, and their time zones don't always concur with the time zones that I'm at, and so I have to get them while I can get them. And rather than not get them, I opt to pre-record them and have a conversation with them because, the information that they're presenting is very valuable. So I always make every effort to get them, and so that's why sometimes you'll hear me do a pre-recorded show. It doesn't devalue the quality of what we're doing. It just simply makes for access is what it's all about, right? So I am here at the studio still on the air, and I wanted to remind you about my newsletter, which comes out every Sunday evening. I know you get tired of me talking about this, but it's valuable for me to get this out there. It's a newsletter that I have created about 2 or 3 years ago, and now I've included video as well. The video piece is sort of an overview of the planet going forward, where things are, how things look, and for the coming week. And then I break out into individual signs, all 12 signs of the zodiac for the week to come. So the week snapshot is a very good indicator of what's going to be happening in your life. And it's important that you read your rising sign as well as your sun sign. And the reason I do that is because when you read the two of them together, you're going to be getting 80 to 85% accuracy on what's to be happening in your life to come. And it really comes down to the room that you're going to be in. It's sort of like, you think of your life as a series of rooms that you traverse and live in. And when you're living in those rooms, that's when you can see the activity. And the activity is live, it's real, and, it's a very viable time to be able to, see what's going on, which room are you in, where's the activity. Now, many of you may say, I know where that activity is, but what is to come from that activity is what's most important. That's where the advice really comes from, because when you have major planets in major rooms of your life, it's an opportunity to rise to the occasion, address the situation, and march on. So I'm here if anybody wants a reading. The number to call is 1-714-364-4353. I'll be here for a little while longer. If anyone decides to call in, that's great. If not, I certainly understand. What I've done here is I sort of extended the hour a little bit each time so that I'm on afterwards, because if I do a pre-recorded show like I did this week, and actually I did the same thing last week, because again, it was a case of a person who I was trying to get a hold of. And they can't always call in. That's what it comes down to. So I've got to accommodate them, and it's more important for me to present good quality audience, guests, than it is to stay on the air and just talk to myself, which I can easily do. So that's part of the reason why I do that. So I'm happy to get people calling in and seeing what they have to say. And I've got a call right now, so let's see what they have to say. Okay, hello, you're on the air. What's your name?
Hi, Deborah.
Oh, good, Deborah. Okay, and Deborah, what is your birth information?
March 20th, 1959.
3/20/59, and do you know what time?
I believe it's 11:26 p.m.
11:26 p.m., and do you know where?
Yes, Quincy, Massachusetts.
Quincy, okay. You must be a Massachusetts person. Obviously, you will be calling from that area. Let me just bring up your chart and see what we can get for you and tell you where you are in your world today. I'm glad that you were able to get in. And I know that have you been listening to the show before in the past?
Yes, I have.
Good.
I have.
And I'm glad you were able to call in.
I was going to say today was the first time on this format, but I really liked it. It was a good show.
Oh, good. I'm glad to hear that. It's good to get new people calling in, and I actually think I might even know who you are. So now that I think about it, I sort of recognize some of the aspects of the chart, so it's always good to do that. But my father was born on March the 20th, so you're born right on the cusp, which is an interesting place to be. You have Jupiter on your ascendant through your natal chart, and your sun sign is at 29 degrees Pisces, so you're born right on the cusp of Pisces and Aries, which gives you, even though you're a Pisces by, definition, you pick up a lot of Aries qualities as a result of being so close to that cusp line. I think of it sort of like a color wheel where you would go from the really rich colors to a gradient as you get closer to the edge. So close to the edge where you are, you're definitely picking up some of that strong Aries energy that's there. And when you have your natal Mars is in your seventh house at 18 degrees Gemini, also a very strong characteristic since Mars rules Aries, that would be a very predominant piece of who you are. You're sort of very motivated by relationships and who you're with. Now, your moon and Uranus both are at 11 and 12 degrees in Leo, giving you a very powerful persona. You're a person not to be messed with. You have a very strong emotional base and a very confident person with a great deal of ambition and empathy and a deep spiritual well, because those both planets appear in your 8th house. That's a very strong component there. I think when you combine that Leo moon with the Jupiter ascendant, you've got a person who loves to travel, because your ascendant is at 1 degrees. Jupiter is at 1 degree Sagittarius on your ascendant. So that indicates a person who enjoys travel and gets out there. And traveling is actually one of the ways that you heal yourself and actually come into your own. I would spend as much time traveling, if I were you, as possible, simply because I think it's a place where you actually find yourself. Sometimes people find themselves in a mirroring quality, and the mirror that represents you best, that you learn the most from, that reflects who you are, is picked up by the travel. And when you're traveling, I think that you get the greatest, boost to who you really are. You sort of come into your own. You really light up when you're in that sort of environment. The challenges that you have coming forward are you currently have Saturn right on the cusp of your 11th and 12th house. So Saturn is going to go retrograde in a little while, and it'll go backwards. As a matter of fact, I'll tell you exactly when that is. Saturn goes retrograde. I've got to look at my ephemeris to be certain of this. I usually have these dates in my head, but there's an awful lot of dates to remember. Saturn goes retrograde on, it actually does not go retrograde until the beginning of March. So right around March 2nd, unfortunately, towards your birth month, on the 23rd of March, it's going to go retrograde and will remain so. It'll go back as far as the 16 degrees, and then July of 2014 it'll go direct again. So it will work its way through your 12th house. The 12th house typically is a time of endings or of closure. So it's a great time to sort of wrap things up. It's a time, if you are in transition, Saturn would sort of allow you to tie the loose ends together. So when you think about that you may be working on a project, you may have some sort of part of your life that there's a door closing in. This would be a time when you might see some of the responsibility of that happening. The good news and the promise in your life, which is represented by transiting Jupiter, is in your 8th house. The 8th house really is about a deepening of spirituality, also about getting outside money coming your way, which could come through inheritance or insurance claims, divorce settlements, alimony, all those sort of things that have to do with outside money. And outside money means that it comes from another source other than your own. So those are the two things that I look at mostly right now. When I look at your chart, I grasp the ideas of who you are as an individual. Then I look for Saturn and I look for Jupiter, because Saturn represents the challenges in your life and Jupiter represents the promise. And that's about all I can do in a short time such as this. But hopefully that will give you some insight as to where you are and what's going on with you.
You're absolutely spot on about the travel thing. I have to say, I just smiled when you said that, because I've just recently come back, and I can't explain why, but I just feel so alive and just sort of.
Yeah, well, you have that very strong Sagittarius rising sign, and the Sagittarius rising is a person, and the rising sign is a figure and a characteristic that we imbue more so as we get older, and because it becomes more comfortable. We become more comfortable in our rising sign. Sagittarians love to travel; they love adventure, and there's something about that escapist quality that gets you out of your routine, that introduces you to new characters and places and people and things and colors and textures and vocabulary. All of those things are all part of what it means to travel, and they are incredibly invigorating for you. And they're sort of like your lifeblood. And you've got Pluto in your ninth house, so it's sort of almost like it's your duty to do that. So I would encourage you to get out there.
I have to.
Yeah, as much as you
would you feel like that combines well with a work possibility too? Because that's something I've
if you have a work possibility,
playing with for a while to try to find some way to make that part of what I need to do in terms of a money making thing.
Yes, if you could combine a job that puts you in the travel zone and satisfied a career at the same time, you'd be killing two birds with one stone, literally. You'd be providing for yourself and you'd be getting yourself out on the road, so you would satisfy both things. There's something about being on the road that you see almost like as a child, almost through childlike eyes as an adventure. There's a certain excitement that goes through it, and it's like exploring new places, even if you've never been there before, and they may not be necessarily exotic places. I mean, you may go to Kansas City or Duluth, Minnesota, but you still, because you haven't been there before, there still is an air of excitement just because it's a new place. So it's a wonderful idea.
So in terms of what you said about March and towards July, how does that play out in terms of some sort of a work opportunity?
Well, what it would do is it would put you
before then I should.
Well, I think it would put you into a situation, as Mars moves out of Virgo and into Libra, it would be a very good time to start looking for work. So even though this is coming into the end of the year when some people may not hire, it actually is a good time for you to be motivated there. Mars will be moving into your 10th house, and it would actually be a pretty good time for you to start looking for work in that time. And you may very well find that new budgets are coming through and people are ready to gearing themselves up for January, and they may, in fact, actually hire. So it's not a bad time to go look. So.
Okay. All right.
So that's all I have for you. It's hard to give more than that out in such a short time, but I think that you've got, I would say in the next between now and the end of the year, it'd be a great time to look for work. I think you have a fairly good shot at it if you can get out there, and I would definitely get a job that allows you to spread your wings. So.
Excellent. Okay.
All right.
Well, I'll consider that my mandate.
Very good.
Thank you
Thanks
so
for
much,
calling.
Chris.
Take care.
I
Bye-bye.
really appreciate it. Have a good
You're
one.
welcome.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye. Okay, we're going to get another call here. Hello, you're on the air.
Hi, it's Kathy from Maryland. How are you?
Good. And what is your birthday?
12/13/1953.
12/13/53. And the time?
10:05 a.m.
10:05 a.m. And where are you from? Where were you born?
I was born in Utica, New York.
Utica, New York. Lovely Utica, New York. Way up in the hills there, right?
Up in the, yeah. Uh-huh.
It's an interesting spot. I mean, you're in the snow belt up there, right?
Yes.
Yeah, and it's one of those places where you typically spend a lot of time shoveling, right?
Right. That's why I moved to Maryland.
Very good. So, did you work for the government?
I do.
Did you get sequestered?
No, because we're funded by the banks.
Okay. Oh, gee. Well, of course, the banks. Got to watch out for them. They're always going to be landing on their feet, aren't they?
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. So, all right, Debbie. I have you. Your sun sign is 21 degrees Sagittarius. Your moon is at 20 degrees Pisces, and your rising sign is Aquarius. So, anytime you read your astrology, regardless of where it may be, whether it's online or on your phone or wherever you get your astrology feed from, or hopefully my newsletter, you're always going to want to read Sagittarius, and you're always going to want to read Aquarius. Because Aquarius is your rising sign. The rising sign takes on a very powerful part of who you are. And you could also read Pisces, too, just to be on the safe side. When you read those three pieces, you get a much more accurate picture of who you are and where the information will be coming in your life coming forward. So it's really important to be able to keep that going. The areas that, and I'm going to have to be real quick on this one, the areas that you seem to have the most sort of challenge right now are sort of in your 9th house, which really is about education and learning new skills perhaps. Travel might also be an issue there. And the area where you have the most promise is in your 6th house, which is about the house of health and daily work. So actually daily work, on one hand, might actually be an area where you could find some promise, particularly with regard to, your, the amount of effort that you can put into your daily job. All of those things become very, very evident as you go forward, and they have great promise with regard to your daily activities are really where you find the greatest promise, is what I guess I'm saying. Are you there? And also, okay. And so it's about being able to operate on a daily basis. So this becomes a very important piece of who you are. And so even though work may appear to be onerous and tedious at times, you also want to see that it has great value as well for you. And the challenge comes from the ability to travel and in training. Travel and training seem to be where you're having the most trouble right now. So I would look at that as an area for putting your effort in. And I thank you very much for calling. Unfortunately, I have to get off the air. So there we go. And try to call back in again if you like, and we'll do the best we can to get you hooked up.
Thank you.
You're very welcome. Okay, take care.
When I said, like, man, who cares? Look what I said about myself. And most people have a good sense of humor about it. Chris is a friend of mine.
You would hope that most could laugh at themselves, but it's Hollywood.
Some people, they take, that's the name of my special, the reason